Hello and welcome to Under the Dome. I'm your host, Dave Breakenridge. This is the first episode in a new video series from the Edmonton Journal and Edmonton Sun newsroom. We'll be exploring the latest news in Alberta politics, talking to the politicians and policymakers you need to hear from, plus we'll be getting updates and analysis from the reporters and experts who understand the issues. And there's no better time to kick off this show because MLAs were back in the House this week.
To the Premier, will you please release updated modelling so all Albertans can understand the nature of the challenges that we are facing?
The models that we released in mid-April turned out to be off by a factor of 95%.
As Alberta tries to reset after COVID-19 shutdowns and a pandemic recession, jobs and the economy are going to be a key focus for both parties in the legislature this fall. On the show today, we have Government House Leader Jason Nixon and Alberta NDP Leader Rachel Notley. I know that you can't give me all the details of bills that may be becoming before the House until they're introduced in the House, but I'm just wondering if you can set up for us what are your main priorities for this session, or what kind of legislation may you be looking at introducing in the legislature this fall?
Well, our priorities for the session are the same as they've been for a while, which is to continue to implement legislation that will help create jobs and will focus on the government's primary goal, which is keeping our economy going and being able to help us get through the unprecedented economic crisis that we find ourselves in. At the end of the day, as the Premier says, we are focused all the time on getting Albertans back to work. And so you'll see some of that in the legislative session upcoming. Also, in addition to that, we're going to continue to implement the platform that we ran on. We're proud of the fact that over 75% of that platform has already been implemented. And so we'll continue to fulfill the promises that we made to Albertans, but at the same time focusing on legislation that helps us get back to work.
The government announced last week that staffers, like political staffers in the Premier's office, would be taking something around a 7% pay cut. I'm just wondering what other public sector workers could be facing a similar pay cut, and does this move set up the possibility of job cuts like the 11,000 jobs that will be cut at AHS to contract out services?
Well, to be clear, I mean, the 11,000 at AHS, you're right, that's moving to privatization. That does not mean that all those individuals are losing their jobs. Many of them will work for the new contractors. It's just a more efficient way to be able to provide the services inside those facilities. It was also a platform commitment that is being fulfilled. But you're correct, Dave. I mean, we see the Premier leading by example. He's taken a 15% pay cut. MLAs and ministers have taken a 10% pay cut, and our staff have now taken a 7% pay cut. The reality is we're facing an unprecedented economic situation here in this province, and we believe Albertans are in this all together, and we're going to continue to work together to be able to get out of it. But we also have to recognize, those of us who are working in the public service and those of us who are elected, that the private sector has seen an unprecedented decline inside this province, many people losing 10, 25%, and even 100% of their paychecks. And so this is a clear leadership moment to make it clear that we have to work on this together and recognize that the private sector is in trouble and the public sector has to do their part. As for specifically how negotiations are going to go with unions and the things that are taking place, I mean, I have to refer you to Mr. Taves, of course, who's the lead on that. But I think what is clear is that we need to work together, and our goal is not to see job loss, but we do have to work together to be able to get our fiscal house in order.
Now, more on the jobs front, the economy in Alberta is still struggling. Obviously, we've been dealing with an oil price collapse earlier this year, the pandemic recession. At the end of September, unemployment was up near the 12% mark for Alberta, and the government has made job creation one of the key pillars of its mandate. You just mentioned that off the top. Now, part of that was the accelerated cut to corporate taxes. The question remains whether that will create jobs in the short term, but how long can Albertans expect to wait before we start to see the fruits of that policy move?
Well, look, it takes time. You're right. Most economists are in agreement that move will create jobs. In the short term, we have to do other measures. You're seeing that take place all across the province. This government has been focused on stimulus measures to be able to help create work and help get us through this hump, and that's going to continue in the coming months. But we do expect that we will begin to see the fruit of those tax cuts over the coming months. In addition to that, we think we've already seen it. We've seen some investment coming back into the province. Some of the job numbers that we just seen recently certainly are on the right trend. The reality is this is going to take a long time to be able to get out of this process, but we have to build the foundation now for us to be able to accomplish that, and that's what you see with moves like the tax cut, and you'll continue to see those type of measures taking place inside the legislature.
Now, the government is facing a $24 billion deficit this year, which leaves many people talking about the need for a sales tax in Alberta. Has the government ruled out the possibility of a sales tax? And if it has, what other revenue options are being considered?
Well, to be clear, Alberta is not bringing in a sales tax during the fall session. The reality is that would be against the law, and for there to be a sales tax, there would have to be a referendum and a conversation with Albertans, and I'm not saying that is where the government is headed. And Minister Taves and the Premier will have more to say on the direction that they're headed, particularly as we go into 2021 as they table the budget. But here, where we need to focus right now is on investing in the right spots to create jobs, while at the same time recognizing that we have to get Alberta's fiscal house in order and have a talk about the places where we are overspending. Albertans, before anybody can have a conversation about the revenue side of the balance sheet, there needs to be a conversation about the expense side. We spend significantly more per capita than any other province, and Albertans expect us to be able to have that conversation first before you start talking about revenue.
Minister, thanks very much for your time. In the 2019 election, the NDP government was unseated by the UCP, largely in part to economic issues. Now the NDP is making the economy a key focus of its caucus in this campaign with the launch of their Alberta's Future campaign, which Rachel Notley announced October 15th.
No jobs have been created, and he's asking every Albertan to pay for his failed plan, and now it looks like they're going to accelerate the cost. Not only do we have no jobs from this, Albertans are paying higher school fees, higher tuition, higher car insurance, and yep, higher taxes. Worse, he's threatening the most vulnerable. He's throwing folks off the seniors' drug plan, threatening to kick disabled Albertans off of AISH, cutting in-class supports for kids with autism. Why is this Premier making the most vulnerable Albertans pay for his no jobs corporate handout?
NDP leader Rachel Notley joins me now. Ms. Notley, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
What has prompted such a visible and deliberate push on the part of you and your party to make the economy a key focus of the NDP this fall session?
Well, I think, it's a very obvious situation that we're in right now. Albertans are deeply concerned about their ability to make ends meet. They're deeply concerned about their economic security. They're deeply concerned about the future of their jobs. And so they are looking to their government for leadership. And what we've seen from this UCP government is a profound failure to provide that leadership. So before the pandemic, this government had introduced their $4.7 billion corporate handout. Before the pandemic, the report card on that was essentially contained in the annual report of the 1920 year. And as you may recall, this government, the UCP government, went out of their way to pass legislation to give themselves permission to avoid sharing the outcome of that first year, that annual report, as it was legislatively required to do in June of 2020, and instead gave themselves permission to release it at the end of August under other numbers about the financial ramifications of COVID, so that people would be less aware of what happened in 2019 and 2020. What happened in 2019-20 were three things. The economy shrank, we lost 50,000 jobs, and the deficit doubled from $6.3 billion under our government, slightly better than what we had projected in the election, to over $12 billion under Jason Kenney. So that was their economic plan. Then the pandemic hit, and the UCP's only answer was to accelerate the corporate tax handout, and at the same time to continue to say things like diversification is a long-term luxury. What we believe is that Albertans really don't believe that they want to see the government show leadership on diversification. And I'm not saying it's easy, and it's certainly not easy in the middle of a pandemic, but what we have to do is have a public conversation about this so that we hold ourselves and the government and Albertans to some degree accountable for the progress that we can make on this, because we have to diversify the economy if we're going to create long-term sustainable jobs, and that is something that's fundamental to what Albertans are focused on these days.
in the election, the UCP kind of set themselves up as being the party of the economy, and they wanted to promote jobs, economy, and pipelines. How does the NDP manage to counteract the idea that it may not be that party or the choice for Albertans when it comes to economic issues?
Well, we do so, Dave, with the facts. And so if I just go back to what you just outlined there, you are quite right that in the last few short months, the UCP has started saying the word diversification, and that's a great step forward. But there's a thing, the pattern that we have seen develop over the last few months, which is really quite frustrating to me, which I think actually raises the level of dishonesty with Albertans to new heights. So, for instance, in the post-secondary sector, we have seen over 4,000 people fired. We have seen hundreds of millions of dollars taken from that sector. And then we turn around and we see Doug Schweitzer walk around throwing himself a little party with the press for giving $1 million here, $1 million there, and writing press releases that say diversification. But what they've done is they've actually thrown the post-secondary sector into quite a high level of chaos, and they have cut hundreds of millions of dollars out of innovation programs that existed before. And this is a pattern that we see throughout their efforts, is that they make massive cuts and then they inject a fraction of it back in, and they try to say, oh, look at us, we're diversifying. So I think, therefore, what we need to do is talk with Albertans about the facts. You mentioned hydrogen, and that's a perfect example. If you read their hydrogen strategy and you compare it to what we rolled out, theirs is a plan to make a plan to make a plan. Ours includes a number of concrete recommendations that can get us to work now as we work to catch up with those jurisdictions who are already ahead of us. So there's a difference in, I think, intended outcome. Right now, their outcome is about talking points. What we're trying to do is actually get Albertans to the table, not just New Democrats, not just undecided voters, but UCP voters now and potentially in the future, as well as the UCP itself, to put concrete ideas down, share the best ones, throw out the ones that don't work. But honestly, there is just, this is such a critical time. We can't be playing games with talking points and press releases. We really have to do everything we can to think about how we can come together to go into the future in a way that actually is going to support Alberta jobs and Albertans.
Now, the state of the economy is top of a lot of people's minds in Alberta this fall. Are there any other issues that the NDP will be trying to highlight in the fall session?
Well, of course. I mean, the other thing that we know Albertans are deeply concerned about is healthcare. They're concerned about how well we're responding to COVID. They're concerned about how equipped we are to respond to COVID, because they're seeing the cases escalate quite alarmingly just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And they're concerned about the future of our healthcare system, because we're seeing, just last weekend we saw the UCP pass a resolution to pursue private funding of healthcare. And today, when I asked the Premier about it in the House, he equivocated, and he tried to pretend we were talking about something else, which we were not, and he knows full well. And yet his party has passed a resolution calling for private funding, and last in July they ended their session by passing legislation that laid the groundwork for building the capacity to deliver privately funded healthcare. And then, of course, they're also expanding private delivery of publicly funded healthcare at a time when the whole country is giving that a second look, because of the clear evidence we're seeing around what that does to the quality of care in places like long-term care homes. So many places across the country are moving away from that. This government is running towards it, even though we've seen greater fatalities and tragedies in those privatized settings.
Now, just when Albertans hear about the Premier's plans to privatize, outsource, and fire 11,000 healthcare workers, his party takes it one step further. At the UCP AGM, his party voted in favor of a resolution to bring in a, quote, privately funded healthcare system. Your party voted to bring in privately funded American-style healthcare to the Premier. Will you stand up today and clearly tell the UCP members they will not get what they want when it comes to privatizing Alberta's healthcare?
The Honourable the Premier.
And what UCP members want, as expressed in our founding convention, in the merger agreement that created our party, is a publicly insured, universally accessible health care system. Hear, hear. Now, I know this may be shocking to the leader of the NDP, but most of those health services are delivered by private corporations. You know what? They're doctors, Mr. Speaker. And every province in Canada has always maintained universally accessible, publicly insured service with a blend of private and public provision of those services. That's the reality that will continue to be the reality in Alberta.
That's our first episode, folks. For all of our provincial politics coverage, be sure to check out edmontonjournal.com. You can watch episodes of this show at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome. To get all the videos right to your feed, you can hit the subscribe button. Thanks again. I'm Dave Breakenridge.